Hello and welcome to another episode of the TLDR podcast. I am Zach Michaelis, TLDR's editor-in-chief. I'm joined today by two of our writers. I don't know if there's like specific titles, you're just two writers at the moment.
Yeah.
We have Rory Taylor.
Hello.
And we have Georgina Finley.
Hello, good afternoon.
I never know if to go, do you know what I mean, go for like the Rory and Georgina and then you both start, or like the sort of little gap. That worked pretty well though.
Difficult to know. Technically the podcast is called Starmergeddon.
Okay, fine.
But I don't know if people call it that or not, or if that's just sort of formal name.
Yeah, I think people love the name. Through.
We'll just move forwards. Ben is unfortunately away today, the usual sort of like, I'd say podcast regular. Is he normally the host as well? He's not actually normally the host, but he's sort of the stalwart of the UK podcast. So you have to make do with us, unfortunately, for this week. We are going to be talking in quite broad strokes about, I think it's fair to say, like Starmer's vibes and whether or not Starmer's like good at politics. This is sort of off the back of this ongoing, I think scandal's too strong, but like issue in UK politics. It's to do with the fact that Starmer has received a whole load of gifts from a Labour donor called Lord Alli. But before we get into that, I have to plug the magazine, which is not something I feel entirely comfortable doing. But as some of our more regular viewers might know, we are doing I was going to say quarterly magazine, but it's not. It's every 4 months. The last one was about the UK election, and the one that will be coming out sort of in December is about, well, it's about like the year of elections. I don't know like how much you guys remember, but the start of the year, there's a lot of talk about how 2024 is the year of elections because something like 2/3 of the world's population, maybe that's too high, are having some sort of election. And so we're just sort of like, we're going to be going over as many of those as we can, maybe with a bit of sort of like meta commentary about whether or not we pay too much attention to elections, whether or not they're as all they're cracked up to be. I don't feel comfortable plugging stuff, it's just not very English. But what I would say is that genuinely we were very, very proud of the last one. And I know that's probably not enough to convince people to buy it. So if you want to hear our slightly like spicier, slightly more academic, slightly more in-depth takes, and also of course if you want to like support the channel, margins aren't great in journalism, we would love it, then please go to, there should be a link somewhere.
toolong.news.
That's
and
the
it will
one.
be in the description.
It'll be in the description.
Yeah. There might be a discount code.
There will be, there's always a discount code, isn't there?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think.
There might be a discount code. So click just to find out. I mean, go on, why not? Anyway, thank you very much for watching. And if you buy it, an even bigger thank you. And let's go into the podcast.
Yeah, I'm ready.
I said that as a question, but let's get into the podcast. So does one of you want to run through the specific, like, what I don't even want to call clothing gate, the Lord Alli issue affair? And then we'll try and branch out into a wider conversation about Starmer's political abilities.
Yes.
I've got some of the numbers, so I'm happy to do the explain a bit, and then if you want to talk a bit more about Lord Alli, perhaps that'd be a good compliment. But yeah, so essentially this news story began during the 2024 election campaign back in July when the FT first published a report of MPs' expenditures since the 2019 general election, or declarations I should say, rather than expenditures, because that is quite a key word. And in the FT's report, Starmer was the one UK politician who had the highest amount of declared gifts or donations, which at the time was £76,000, which is pretty high. But now it's kind of re-entered the news cycle because he's just clocked up over 100k. And this is...
So is that how the story's developed? Because I actually haven't been paying, I'll be honest with everyone here, any attention to this story. But so it came out because he was just top of the list?
It came out because he was top of the list. Okay. And I think at the time, Labour were doing a much better general election campaign than the Tories. And I think the News were looking for something that would be interesting, to discuss. And this emerged. And out of this £76,000, a big chunk of that was this 16.2k donation of work clothing from Lord Alli, who is a Labour member of the House of Lords and former chair of ASOS. For viewers who are not from the UK, ASOS is a big...
Really? ASOS, the clothing brand?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, ASOS, the clothing brand. It's not a brand, company.
Distributor or supplier.
Stocker. Yeah, like the Amazon of fast fashion, I guess.
Yeah.
And then, among the rest of the thousands of pounds, there were various concert tickets, including £698 worth of Coldplay tickets at the Etihad Stadium, Manchester, a family holiday for 4 in Wales at the cost of £4,500, and then various other smaller gifts like tickets to see Adele at Hyde Park in London, tickets to the Commonwealth Games opening ceremony, tickets to a play at the National Theatre, tickets to Royal Box at Wimbledon, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And this became a big story partly because Starmer was had the highest number of donations, but also because in comparison to previous party leaders from both Labour and the Conservatives, that figure of 76,000, now 100k, was considerably higher.
He's also spent the past few months dissing the Tories for sort of like cronyism and having too but chummy relations with their various donors.
So there's a big ethical question around this whole issue, which is why it's interesting. But for comparison, when Jeremy Corbyn was Labour leader between 2015 and 2019, he only declared one gift, which was a £476 Glastonbury ticket in 2017 when he went and everybody was chanting,
"That's good value for money."
Jeremy
Great value for money.
Yeah, he was on stage.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, this is something we can get into a bit later as well, which is how, what actually gets declared versus what is not, and this is a big question we can get into. Ed Miliband as well, from 2010 to 2015 as Labour leader, only declared, I think, about £6,000 worth of British Airways upgrades on flights, and then some Paralympic tickets of unknown value. And then prior to that, David Cameron declared one set of Rugby World Cup tickets being hosted at the Conservative Party's Black and White Ball.
It's a weird one to have to declare.
Yeah.
You thought they'd give it to him for free, no? And the Tories hosting their own
This
Prime Minister.
is what I mean about it.
But I think that the general point that it is weird relative to previous leaders how much is taken. And I presume that's not because other leaders weren't offered stuff. And Jeremy Corbyn wasn't super chummy with business, but I presume it's because they know that the politics of accepting donations is unpalatable. It's not good politics, basically. It looks bad, and you should essentially be turning down Coldplay tickets because you know that the political risk is that the FT do an expose on it later.
Yeah.
Or you accept them and don't declare them.
So this is what you're alluding to. What do you mean by this? As in, is that a problem that people or the media think about?
Well, I've not seen too much discussion of this, I guess because it's such a vague and nebulous issue. If you're trying to discuss something that you can't report on because there's no data, because it hasn't been declared, then you get into this weird...
Sorry, I was going to jump
please.
in. There have been a few times where Starmer has got in a tiny bit of trouble for declaring things late, and you don't really get in that much trouble. It's just like a reminder from the parliamentary commissioner responsible for this stuff that you've got to do it on time, and the whole thing is, sorry, did it late, but I still declared them. But I think it's something I find really frustrating about British politics is that the debate is often framed around, well, have they declared these things or not? And yes, if they've declared them, then it's all fine because it's on the public declaration of interest, so therefore it's fine, there's nothing untoward going on. But it feels like that system we've developed is just like a form of transparent corruption light possibly, because I don't really, if Keir Starmer, for example, and he has received tickets or gifts worth a lot of money from, let's say, the Premier League, they're not doing that because they really like him and just want to treat him. They're doing that because they want to be on good terms with him and have some degree of sort of line of communication to him. Because, for example, when his government is going to, develop this new football regulator, the Premier League have a lot of thoughts about that. Or, for example, Getir, the delivery app, they gave him tickets to, I think it was to a concert, I can't remember which one. Obviously, delivery app companies are going to be really hot on Labour's workers' rights plan. It's about influence and it's about connections. It's not just these companies or these people doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. So when the response to sort of questions about these things, the response is always, oh, I declared them and everything was within the rules. That does, that's fine, that's great, but it doesn't really answer the actual question of, is this a good way of doing politics?
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that, yeah.
I do agree with the fundamental point in terms of declaring a gift or a donation doesn't make that gift legitimate. And it's still, there will be questions about ethical gifts and what sorts of thing is acceptable to accept and what is not. But I do think the framework of transparency is the best form of combating a slide into corruption. Because
why don't you just have a blanket ban on not receiving gifts?
Yes, I think that would be be a very good solution. But then you get into the question of there'll always be people accepting gifts in some way and without any kind of framework for being able to report them. At least if you can declare gifts, it does lend some kind of I don't know. I think if you put a blanket ban on it, I don't think people would receive gifts in that way. I think for sure they would. I mean, it was interesting. I was looking through the specific, the MP's code of conduct and the specific wording, and even just glancing through it, there are a few loopholes that kind of immediately jumped out at me. One being, MPs are required to declare gifts that come from a UK source. But if you think of the number of companies, particularly, property companies or big construction companies maybe, that provide holiday rentals or something, that will probably be based in Jersey, the British Virgin Islands, Guernsey, Luxembourg, whatever, that doesn't technically fall within a category that members have to declare. So, for example, if
isn't that an argument for a blanket ban? Because the blanket ban would be sort of, it wouldn't matter where.
But how do you police that if you can't?
Well, the same way that you police the undeclared ones. I mean, clearly Starmer maybe not has tried as too strong, but Starmer has been late to reporting a couple of things, and people would find out about it. I mean, like, that's sort of what I guess the media is there for, is to sort of be like, we know when all the politicians go on holiday, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it happens with Boris Johnson all the time.
Yeah, exactly. He gets
Who's paying for it to go to Italy?
Yeah.
And then you get a whole lot of press photos from him in Italy, and everyone's going, wait a second, who paid for that? And presumably, I don't know how much they keep on top of like Prime Minister's finances, but maybe if you've got to complement it with some sort of like spending ledger, you'd probably get quite a quick sense of like, oh, okay, well, you didn't tell us, you didn't spend, £100,000 on Italy. Who paid for that? I think you probably could police it quite effectively. I think maybe that's an issue with it. One of the things I think that this is sort of adjacent to, though, and this is one of the arguments that Starmer has made on the clothing front, is that the Prime Minister, I think David Lammy made this argument on LBC or somewhere. The Prime Minister doesn't have a budget for clothing as some other world leaders do. So, the President in America has a sort of $50,000 budget for like expenses, which includes like clothes and stuff to make sure that they can present well on the international stage. And I think that's like a legitimate sort of point in a way. You do want your Prime Minister to look good. I don't want to sound too David Cameron to Jeremy Corbyn here, do up your tie or whatever it was. But I think there's an argument to say that you do want your Prime Minister to dress well and look good. And maybe Starmer is sort of right that actually on the current salary, there's not that much spare for the Prime Minister to spend on nice tailored suits. I don't think that argument really flies with Starmer because he's clearly relatively well off anyway. That's why I think this is such bad politics to receive £16,000 worth of clothes when I presume he probably could have just spent that money himself and avoided this whole scandal. But I think that maybe in another case, someone who wasn't as well off as Starmer is, there would be an argument to say, well, actually the Prime Minister's pay just doesn't cover the sort of breadth of expenses that we sort of do tacitly expect from a Prime Minister. We expect our Prime Minister to look good, to host well, to, we do like them to travel well as well. And maybe there just isn't the funding for that. So I think it's sort of, there's an interplay between this question and the wider question of sort of like MP pay. Do you see what I mean? MP and sort of politician pay in the UK. What do you think about that?
It's a difficult one because if you take Starmer, if his salary went up by £16,000, I don't think he'd stop accepting these gifts.
That's what I'm saying. It's bad politics. Okay, so we're agreeing.
And I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to have that kind of pot set aside to, as a budget for the Prime Minister's office. I think lots of people wouldn't like that, and would just say I'd prefer it if they paid for it themselves. But that would probably be that would at least avoid the situation that we've got now, where you've got some random lord paying for his clothes and his glasses and his wife's clothes, which is a bit weird.
Yeah, it is a bit weird. Yeah. Exactly. I think here the thing is that you're right. People would be pushed back against the idea that politicians generally should be paid more. I mean, it's such an unpopular topic. But if you framed it in the correct terms, you said, look, the trade-off here is either we just pay politicians more out of the public purse, or we have this weird situation where they can't quite make ends meet or as much as they'd like to, and so they have to take dodgy gifts, for weird stuff as well. Clothes and Coldplay tickets. It's a bit weird, you know what I mean? Like, I think you're so right. It's so clearly influence in a way.
Yeah.
Because
and this is a good chance to talk about Lord Alli, because at face value, it might seem strange to for this to be an issue, because he is a Labour Lord. Yeah. Like, why is it an issue that a Labour Lord is donating to a Labour Prime Minister? What's the sort of conflict of interest there? But the reality is he is a business person, and also he's not just giving that money he's not just like a separate person from the administration who's giving money sort of just because he wants to. He's involved in the Starmer project. He's been a significant donor to Labour for a few years now. He had a press pass after the election, so he could go into, not a press pass, sorry, a Downing Street pass, so he could go in and out of Downing Street after the election. He's apparently sort of been, maybe pressure isn't the right word, but he's been making his thoughts on public appointments to the government as well, and he hosts a lot of like donation drives, sort of like party events or sort of government events. It's this thing where you've got this rich figure sort of involved without an official role, handing out money to people for various things, and sort of having that, being able to whisper in the ear of the Prime Minister. It's really not, it doesn't look very ethical.
No. And
it's even worse when you consider that, like you said, Starmer's main attack line against Conservatives has been, corruption, sleaze, impropriety, that type of stuff.
Yeah.
I think
it's really not good.
I think for me, that's the biggest flaw of this Starmer thing for him, is that his brand of very moral politics just doesn't really hold up. When you are accepting these gifts, it's
a bit of a. I think it's sort of. I understand why he prosecuted that attack line on Tories, but it's something that Tony Blair did. I think he famously said you've got to be sort of whiter than white or whatever. Wasn't it? Every time there was
wow.
It's the ghost of family.
Yeah, you mentioned Tony Blair.
And that just came back to bite him every time there was anything with a hint of whiff of cronyism. I think, I don't want to get too much into the finance specifics, but I think we all agree that this is bad politics. And I thought this is what I wanted to talk about in this podcast, which is that I think this is sort of the latest example of Starmer not being perhaps as good as politics as maybe some Labour supporters hoped. I think that's fair to say. I remember a podcast a couple of weeks ago was the cronyism scandal, and that was about public appointments and the fact that Labour are appointing sort of Labour allies to certain civil service roles. The other one that I think is quite glaring, and it's sort of dominated the headlines for a while now, is the winter fuel allowance thing. The fact that they've withdrawn or started means testing winter fuel allowance for pensioners. I don't think that's necessarily a bad policy in sort of like pure fiscal terms, but I think the fact that it has been like sort of thrown out into the political ether in isolation. If you did it as part of a budget, it wouldn't really get as much sort of coverage. But it's just been like the only issue in Parliament at the moment. It literally ticks like all of the sort of emotive boxes. It's pensioners, it's fuel, it's winter. It lends itself so naturally to a Daily Mail front page of a cold pensioner just sort of dying in a cave. It's such an obvious political misstep, and whatever the sort of financial savings available are, it just is not worth the political cost. I think I think that actually the fact that so far he's been, broadly speaking, bad at politics. I want to know if you guys both think the same about that, because I think he's been pretty bad at politics, but I'm not sure. Maybe that's unfair. I think it just really doesn't bode well, given that the political project that he's about to embark on is very difficult. It's not like he's come in sort of, again, Tony Blair era, nice strong growth, nice good public finances, nice macro global environment. He's got to turn around a sort of like a sinking ship, and I think that is quite difficult.
Yeah, I agree with the assessment that so far it seems like he's bad at politics. I mean, it's a bit of a sort of definitive thing to say, but based on what's happened since the election, where he was fighting, it was all about change, and he did try and put across like a positive attitude towards the future. But since coming into office, and I understand why they've done this as part of this strategy, but it's just been really bleak stuff. speeches about how things are going to get worse before they get better, and he needs 2 terms before, he can really improve things. And it's about tying the current difficulty and the failures to the Tories. I understand that, but it's really not inspiring or sort of. I don't know. It just doesn't inspire confidence.
Well, you said positive.
Yeah,
that's a good word.
I think you can do that thing where you attack the Tories for those things.
Why are you smiling?
Yeah.
No, I'm going to let you finish.
Okay. You can attack the Tories for those things and try and say, yes, it will get worse before it gets better, but you have to have some kind of positive spin. You need to make people feel good about something.
Yeah,
so far we haven't had
something positive to aim for, as it were, to make the sacrifice worthwhile.
And maybe we're yet to get there, but
I still think we're yet to get there. I remember this is recalling what we talked about pre-election. But I don't think Starmer has been a terrible politician since coming into office. Not at all. I think he's been the sort of politician that he wanted to be, which was exceedingly cautious, exceedingly kind of reserved and withdrawn and held back, and very transparent, which is also part of this, declaring 100K's worth of gifts. And I think that is a conscious decision in, marked contrast to Boris Johnson in particular. And yeah, I agree that there's not a lot of hope and optimism and inspiration around at the moment, but also there's a lot of realism, I think, and I think that's...
And you don't mind that?
I don't mind that for now. I think if it's still the same vibes or whatever, in a year's time I might change my tune. But I think it's still fairly early days.
It will be interesting to see what the conference is like, because you can't have a conference and just be miserable the whole time, can you? Surely they've got to...
So they've got cause for celebration. Vibes, right? Yeah. Labour are back in power, no?
Yeah. Well, I'll be able to report back.
There you go. That's a little teaser for everyone. Georgina will be one of our 2 people at conference, so you better ask some hard-hitting questions.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
I think I still think bad at politics is sort of a fair, very general term, but
I think we've got a bit of a spectrum going on. I mean, you're relatively sympathetic to the way he's performed so far. You don't mind the politics, and I think it's interesting what you said. You said it's what he wants to be, which I think is sort of true.
Starmer's politics is off-brand for me in as much as it's not how I would be as a politician. But I think what I respect about it is he ran on his platform, however unpopular it was with a lot of the electorate on the left, and he has held fast to it, and he's been pretty much the same since coming into office as he was before. And I respect that more than, I think, throwing a load of promises out there that you're not going to keep, or going really hard on the radical change agenda and then not delivering. I think at least, he's making tortoise movements. Tortoise movements.
Sounds like a proverb.
Yeah. I suppose you're right in that he hasn't really done anything surprising. He has behaved exactly the way that I would have expected before the election, which...
I'm not saying that makes him a good politician.
It doesn't mean those things are good, politics, but it's not surprising.
But it's consistent at least. And I think, honestly, in what we've had in this country for the last decade, people are kind of all right with it, And this latest scandal, the declarations, the gifts thing, I do, and maybe this is a slightly controversial take, I do think it's possibly a bit overblown. Just because I think, again, what it says is that Starmer is trying to be transparent. He is trying to be...
That is a very generous read on that.
I don't think he's trying to be transparent.
He's just obliged to do so.
I suppose
He shouldn't. He took it in the first place. That's the mistake.
Yeah, and there were obviously issues with him not declaring things on time. So maybe I'll take that back actually.
But I think you used 2 words there that I agree with one of them and not the other. So you said that it's cautious politics, which I definitely agree with. But he says also consistent. And I think one of the issues I have with Starmer's current brand of politics at the moment is that I don't think it is consistent in certain ways. I think if you're doing cautious, like small c conservative politics, I think it has to be backed or like burnished by a clear political project. You're sort of tiptoeing your way along to this end point. I think you could maybe, I don't know what a perfect example is, and so the natural one that comes to mind in a way is is Thatcher, or maybe, or Blair is probably a better one, in that Blair, very technocratic to begin with, very sort of like tiptoe. But there was a big framing at the end of it. There's this sort of like third way, there's this sort of like private-public partnership thing going on. There's this sort of like a lot of talk about sort of equality of opportunity. That's when that sort of discourse is really kicking in. There's this sort of, I guess, this sort of wider transatlantic neoliberalism thing going on about efficiency and all that sort of shenanigans, and then also like sort of financializing an economy in lots of ways, making the Bank of England independent, that sort of thing. I think there is a wider project there. I think the third way best encapsulates it. But I think Starmer doesn't really have that yet, and he's sort of tiptoeing to nowhere at the moment.
I changed my opinion again. I'm going all over the place.
I'm flattered I convinced you there.
Well, I don't know. In a way, I do agree in that.
The main project, the sort of driving goal that he set out is just a push for growth, isn't it? But that's not really a political project.
But then I just don't know where. I mean,
it kind of feels like Labour are still trying to untangle this mess that they keep referring to that's been left by the Conservatives. But they also have had a long time to untangle that whilst they were in opposition as well.
So I agree, and I think that like the first thing to do is a lot of untangling. You have to do a lot of untangling, and like I guess, you know, in lots of ways his first thing to do is sort of just get stuff on a steady footing, and then you can talk about your next project. But again, I think this goes back to what we talked about before, is that you have to have a sense of what the next project is. You have to be able to like motivate people, be like, no, this is what we're moving towards eventually. There's loads of untangling to do. You know, like fixing the NHS, it's sort of, your politics aside, you know, you just have to bring waiting times down. It doesn't matter if you're Tory or Conservative or Reform or whatever, you just have to bring waiting times down. And the same thing with the prison system. You did a video on that a while ago. You know, it's again just making sure prison capacity is better. You know, it doesn't really matter how you do that. And then I guess to a certain extent the budget. You know, you just have to bring the debt burden down. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but you think you have to. I think all of those things he can fix, but then there has to be this sort of like, okay, if we fix this and we sort of get on a steady footing, where are we using that steady footing to move off to?
What are we building?
You know what, Labour conference will be really interesting actually from the looking for a project angle, you know, to see whether people are coming up and Wes Streeting is saying, this is our plan for the next 5 years to save the NHS. Whether Angela Rayner will step up and say, this is our plan for how we're actually going to get these houses built, more than just like saying it and hoping that it will happen. It will be to kind of gauge the energy and the optimism, whether that is there, or whether they are clearly still just all tangled up in this mess that they're still trying to.
On the inconsistent vibes, I think the winter fuel payment is a good example of that. There are certain things that feel very left-coded in Labour's politics at the moment. So renationalising the rail. I mean, it's a moderate renational, but that's the language they use. Or there's quite a lot of stuff about like the 4-day week. That feels quite left-coded, or a lot of the workers' rights stuff is pretty intense. A lot of the rental reforms, by the way, they're pretty close to price controls. This super left-wing, but pretty left-wing by current standards. But then the winter fuel payment and a lot of the austerity talk, that feels quite right-coded. Do you see what I mean? Like, I think there's just and maybe people don't have an issue with that in the same way that I do, but my personal take is that I think that politics, it doesn't really inspire anyone. It just sort of confuses people a little bit. And again, maybe this is part of this sort of technocratic tiptoeing we're doing to a steady footing where then we can find a project. But I think that so far that they haven't like articulated a project. And I think actually you're right, conference is probably the time where they sort of decide upon that. I think in lots of ways, they haven't actually decided what their project was. And maybe they didn't. I think they started off in like 2022. I was reading back on it a while ago, 2022, 2021, just after Corbyn. You know, just after the pandemic, and the pandemic all of a sudden opened up this space for potential. Everyone's talking about massive government borrowing, we can do cool stuff. And I think they are quite left-wing then. You know, Starmer's, there's a lot of, the green energy spending is the best example of this, yeah? 28 billion a year. That's like 10 times what it currently is, what now GB Energy is going to get. And then they're sort of just curtailed by, I think quite a lot of it is Liz Truss and the sort of like her bumping up against the fiscal limits.
I mean, when one of the justifications that a minister used for the winter fuel cut was something along the lines of, if we don't do this, you know, we risk crashing the economy. Yeah. It's like, that's not how it, you know, that's not how the Liz Truss thing happened.
It's not how the Liz Truss thing by. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. But that seems to be their defence mechanism.
Yeah.
To bring it back to Starmer and his brand of politics, I've got a question I want to put to you, Zach.
Oh, very exciting. The interviewer becomes the interviewee.
Uno reverse.
Yeah.
That's when you play
it.
You use the word technocratic tiptoeing, and upstairs before I asked you whether you thought you would classify Starmer as a technocrat, and I wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about why you think he has technocratic vibes, because this is also an interesting theme in relation to Europe as well, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the Starmer just does have technocratic vibes. I think that's fair to say, and I think he sold himself in lots of ways as a bit of a technocrat. I think this is in part reaction to what I was just saying. I think once he stopped being left-coded, he sort of just sold himself as like more competent than the Tories. The politics are actually quite similar, you know. I mean, like the best example is like migration. Yeah, Starmer's just been in Italy talking about basically a new Rwanda deal, but with Albania. It's slightly different because they've got to send asylum seekers who have the successful claims back to the UK. But it's quite similar. You're offshoring your migrant processing. And when he was attacking the Tories, he was saying, it's because it's a violation of ECHR and it's expensive. It was never about the principles. It was just about the practicality. Yeah. And Starmer sells himself as just more sort of technocratically competent than the Tories. I think there's a couple of reasons. One of it is that technocrats are quite popular at the moment. People generally, polls suggest, quite like technocrats because they just sort of think politicians are partisan and loud and annoying, and technocrats are just efficient sort of university professors who just sort of, they put their glasses on and get working. But the other reason I think is what I was just talking about is that I don't think there was the political space for sort of an explicitly left-coded project. Or at least I think that's what Starmer thought. And he was
in the UK?
Yeah, and I think it's post-Liz Truss. I think he is worried about spending too much money, and that has spooked people. Post-Corbyn as well, he's trying to differentiate from Corbyn. And also just because the politics of the UK meant that like basically being a more competent version of the Tories was just going to win you the election. I mean, he could have really sort of said anything, he would have won the election. The other thing about being a technocrat is that for that to work, you just have to be good at it. And this is what we go back to, is that so far, I don't know if he is good at it. The other thing I would say is that the successful technocrats have become increasingly good politicians. Mario Draghi, the most successful technocrats around, yeah? The archetypal technocrat is a central bank governor, yeah? Mark Carney was R1 before Mervyn King. No, not before, after Mervyn King. Before Andrew Bailey. Yeah. Mark Carney was sort of chosen in part because he was a good politician. He is a good politician. He's a Canadian. He's got the right vibes. He didn't seem to anyone too close to like finance. Christine Lagarde was picked as ECB banker because she was a good politician and she could sell like slightly more expansive monetary policies. Sorry, this is now getting quite technical. But Jerome Powell is the best example in the US, in that Jerome Powell has no central bank background, and he's been picked as a central banker at the head of the Fed, quite explicitly, I think, by Obama, because it was a politically difficult time for central bankers because they were doing lots of new stuff, and they needed someone who was politically savvy to sell that or to avoid political controversy. And so one of the things I think that politicians like Starmer, maybe this is reading too much into it, but I think the mistake that politicians can make is to look at the popularity of technocrats and assume that that means that technocrat politics is good politics. But what I think the mistake they're making is that actually technocrats have become increasingly political, and what's really happening is we're picking some of our best politicians as technocrats.
Yeah.
Yeah, like and Mario Draghi is objectively an amazing politician, phenomenal politician. He's a charming bloke, he's really funny, he led an Italian government very, very successfully in a country that has been, otherwise beset by a combination of sort of partisan politics and just unpopular politics. And he was uniquely popular. I mean, they are good politicians, and I think the thing that lots of politicians, the mistake they make is to model themselves off technocrats, centre-right, centre-left politicians, but actually not realising that the technocrats today are chosen for their political ability as well.
It's not that
the central bank case.
Technocracy is good and popular, it's that good technocrats are good.
Are good at politics.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You have to do politics. And I think the mistake is to look at the political success of someone like Draghi as the archetype of the sort of technocrat, and think it's just technocracy. It's just that people want the relief of technocracy, but it's the relief of technocracy combined with good politics. And I think the lesson is the same for Starmer, is that actually it's about both. You have to have a technocratic ability and you have to have political ability. You know, I think Tony Blair, people sometimes think of Tony Blair these days a bit as sort of a technocrat. No, you think that's sort of fair?
I mean, I guess all the kind of solutions that he talks about and his sort of pet projects are quite technocratic. But yeah, I feel like, at least my understanding of a technocrat, there is an implied like coming from outside politics kind of thing. And I guess Blair...
this is true, but I think that people sometimes see him today as offering technocratic solutions, you know. It's always framed in sort of very neutral language. It's never... You know, when he has a knack for getting headlines, and whenever it is, it's always framed as just sort of, this is the sensible solution.
Yeah, there's no politics involved. This is how we...
But the ability to sell something as technocratic and as sort of like the only option, you know, because that's what Draghi's doing, you know, classic, there is no alternative, you know, that is, or whatever it takes rather, that is, it's about selling something as a technocratic solution when actually, and basically saying this is the only solution, but you have to sell that, you have to convince people this is the only solution. You know, I think all the great politicians, they feel technocratic, but they feel technocratic because they're very good at convincing electorates this is the only solution. I think Blair is a good one. Merkel, I've just accidentally misquoted with there is no alternative, that's Merkel's phrase. Unbelievably good politician, but had technocratic vibes, no? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And technocratic vibes, but actually because she was very good at sort of crossing political lines and selling her policies as the only sensible one.
And I mean, Starmer is doing things that he is putting out there and saying, we have to do this, you know, not in these words, but there is no alternative, like you said. But I don't think he's doing that well. Yeah.
Exactly. This is my point, is that actually... there is no alternative is a good way of doing it. That's what technocrats are trying to do. They're trying to go, this is the only option, or the best, or the least bad, or something like that. But that is a political task, and doing that is quite difficult. You have to be good at politics to do that. Blair is very good, has always been very good at doing that. The last thing I'll say, is that it involves picking fights with the electorate sometimes. To convince the electorate that the least bad option is the only option, you have to sell it to them, because the least bad, it's still unpopular. You have to sell it to them, and I think so far, Starmer has been a very reactive politician. This was true in the election campaign. He looks at the polls, what's the sort of one that's most popular, I'll go for that. Sometimes you have to sell things a bit. You have to do a bit more active politics rather than reactive politics. And I think that is actually the core issue, to my mind, is it is just reactive politics. I think a lot of politicians are like this. I do think some part, just because polls are so prolific, a lot of politicians just read polls and they just try and pick whatever the public likes most. But public often doesn't know what it wants, or wants the wrong thing, frankly. You know, publics always have competing, publics have competing demands. Sometimes they want multiple things at the same time. Immigration is the best example of this, you know. The public want strong growth, they want a strong NHS, they want, cheap social care, but then they also want zero immigration. You can't have all of those things at the same time. Someone has to make that argument, and you have to convince the public, look, there are trade-offs involved. And you know, Sunak never did that. The Tories never did that. Too afraid of doing it. And Starmer has to do that. And so I think that's my key point, by the way, is that you have to. Technocrats are political, and politics involves convincing electorates sometimes, not just reacting to their stated preferences.
I almost think Starmer has a lack of confidence. I don't know if you two would agree, but I remember even in the head-to-head debates with Sunak, like the biggest difference was just confidence. Like Sunak, regardless of what he was saying, he believed that what he was saying was right, and he was trying to convince people. He was forceful, he was, fairly put together, well argued, even if he did come across as tetchy or whatever. Whereas Starmer was so kind of self-conscious and held back that he was uber, he could barely get his words out because he didn't want to say something that might be slightly the wrong word to use. And when you get to that level of politics, when you're a global leader, you've got to shed any kind of fear or over caution or whatever. It's fine to be cautious. You can be cautious and confident, but I think it is it always just strikes me that there's a fundamental, I don't know if it's lack of self-belief or something, that you just want to kind of shake Starmer and say, you are Prime Minister of the UK now, come on, let's have a bit of gumption.
Ooh, the Prime Minister of a failing country, come on. But I think it goes back to what you said earlier, which is that they don't know what the project is yet, so it's hard to be that confident when you're not entirely sure what you're...
And if your approach is just reactive, then you're never going to be able to work out what that project is, because, it's just inconsistent.
So you sort of agree with my like that basic sense. It's a bit too reactive.
Yeah.
And even I don't know, even if Labour had a really inspiring project or whatever, I can't see Starmer being the person to sell that with the like belief and the passion behind it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think so. I think that's by the way, a really interesting point with the Sunak thing, because the Sunak thing is a perfect point of someone who did try and convince the electorate of something they didn't want to hear. You know, basically austerity. Basically said we don't have the money. But I think that like that never flew because it was austerity, and Cameron Osborne sold that very successfully, by the way. We forget that Cameron Osborne did sell austerity to the public. They said, look, you're going to have to take public service cuts. And it was popular. People believed in all the budget and deficit stuff. It's just not going to fly a second time around, I don't think. And I think actually the issue there is that in lots of ways, Sunak was wrong. And I think everyone now thinks he was wrong as well, because the basic Sunak thing was that you need to balance the budget, but the lesson of the last 10 years austerity has been that actually balancing budgets normally leads to less growth, and the fundamental issue is low growth. So I think Starmer's, you go back to this, you saying that his basic project is growth, but you know, what does that actually look like, and is that consistent with the sort of demands of the people who voted him in? You know, it might be that growth, if you wanted to like get some really obvious growth, cut pension spending, make people work till they're 75, yeah? Well, you could do, and then you invest it all in R&D in Oxford and Cambridge. Screw the North, just why not? We're just gonna, the Golden Triangle, and that's gonna be, you know, that's how you get, if you want a sort of American-style Silicon Valley, do we want that though? Do you see what I mean? And is that consistent with the demands of the electorate? Yeah. No, I don't think it would. And so you have to make that, if you want to go for growth, you have to have a growth strategy. And I don't think they have that either at the moment. I think now I'm getting so pretentious here, but the last thing I'll say is that I do think an issue for a lot of left-wing governments around the world is that the way to square the circle, the demand for growth stuff, it was the Green New Deal. It's what Biden's doing. The Green New Deal was the way they could do it. Because the Green New Deal, remember if you think back a couple of years, supposed to give massive growth, like reindustrialize the economy as well, and then also create all of those like reindustrialized jobs. You know, like you were supposed to, had all those images of people with hard hats. You know, instead of coal miners, you're building solar panels. You know, isn't that great? And we can do that in the north because it's windy, and we can do that. Yeah, there you go. But that turns out to just not be true. And I think that's I really do think this is quite fundamental, because that's such a popular framing. You know, it's what the Green Party in Germany came to power on based in 2021. It's what sort of Starmer was talking about in 2020 and 2021, 2022. It's what Corbyn talked about. And the problem with it is just, I think the main problem is that we don't have the money to do it because it costs quite a lot of borrowing, and we're all scared of borrowing. The Germans have the same issue. We don't want to borrow that much money. But the other thing is that the American experience is the best one here. It just doesn't create as many jobs as people thought it would, because it just turns out that like GB Energy is not going to create 1 million jobs or whatever it was that we lost to coal mining, or however. It's just the actually quite basic reasons. It just turns out that like building solar panels is not like coal mining. You build solar panels, you build them, you go home. You do a little bit of tinkering every so often, but it's not like the industrial jobs of old. There's good data on this from the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. I do think that is one of the ways I sort of see this, is that was like a very popular framing for a lot of centre-left and left-wing governments as a way of sort of like marrying multiple objectives, talking about sort of like higher wages, talking about the energy transition, and then talking about growth. And that worked really nicely. And then it just sort of it doesn't work. And now they're sort of flailing a little bit, being like, okay, so what's the new framework? How can you marry growth with other left-wing objectives? Equality, higher wages, LGBT rights and all that sort of shenanigans as well. And I think that they're sort of been left in a bit of a limbo. You don't see, I don't know, I always think that like, look at like left-wing parties across Europe, and like apart from the Democrats in the US, because the way they solved it was just spend all the money ever, which we just can't do no one has like a really easy solution. In the left in France, you model it and it's another 5% on the deficit. So I just think they're sort of stuck in lots of ways. It's not a very happy sort of conclusion.
But this time next week at the next podcast, Labour conference will have come and gone, and we'll know exactly.
And we'll have a project.
What's going on?
What's going on. Anything else anyone wants to say? Sorry, I went on a bit of a...
You managed to get central banks.
Oh, I know, but you set me up nicely for that. Smacked it down.
Yeah.
No, I think, well, there you go. That is literally everything. Everything you could want to know about this topic has been done. Anyway, thank you very much. This is everything, right? We are done.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, cool. I love this sort of outro, just sort of faltering.
Just declining into
There's no
silence.
actual line. Thank you very much for watching. And if you enjoyed this sort of discussion, please do consider not even subscribing to the magazine, just buying one. Maybe
Test it out.
Test it out. Why not? I mean, I would prefer that you subscribe, obviously, but maybe just buy one. And if you agree with the overwhelming consensus of all the prior readers, that's actually very good, maybe and better than you expected at least, then you can subscribe. But thank you very much for watching, and join us again very soon for both another podcast and an editorial next week.